Elira's bare feet hit the cold stone path as she ran, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The two small pups were gone. One moment they had been playing near the edge of the lavender field, chasing a butterfly between the purple stalks, and the next moment, she had turned around and they had vanished without a sound. "Ren, Fen," she called, her voice cracking as it carried across the open field. No answer came back. Only the wind moved through the lavender, bending the stalks in slow waves, as if the field itself was hiding something from her. She had been the caretaker of these two pups since the day they were left at the orphanage door, wrapped in a single blanket, their tiny bodies shivering in the cold. Ren had one blue eye and one brown eye, and Fen had been born completely silent for the first 3 months of his life, only finding his voice when Elira sang to him every night. In the 2 years since, they had become her entire world. She had no mate, no pack standing, and no family left to speak of. The pups were what kept her feet moving each morning. Now her heart pounded as she pushed through the tall grass at the edge of the field, scanning left and right, praying she would hear their laughter instead of silence. She did not know that somewhere beyond the tree line, a group of armed riders had entered Duskwood territory that same morning, and that her two pups, curious and fearless as always, had wandered straight toward the sound of hooves and metal. Elira reached a break in the field, where the grass had been trampled flat. Her stomach turned. Footprints, large and heavy, crossed over smaller paw prints. She knelt down, pressing her palm against the flattened grass, and for a moment, she could not breathe. Then she heard it. A giggle, high and unmistakable, coming from somewhere ahead, near a cluster of birch trees. She stood so fast her head spun, and she ran toward the sound, ignoring the sharp stones cutting into her bare soles. When she broke through the last row of lavender, what she saw stopped her cold. Ren and Fen were sitting cross-legged in the grass, completely unharmed, in front of a tall man dressed in dark traveling armor, with a silver crest stitched into his chest. He was crouched low to their level, listening to something Fen was telling him with wide, animated hands. Around them stood several armed men, watching their leader with quiet confusion, as if they had never seen him crouch down for anyone. Elira froze at the edge of the trees, her chest heaving, unsure whether to be relieved or terrified. The man's eyes lifted and found hers immediately, as though he had known she was there before she made a sound. He rose to his full height, and even from a distance, she could feel the weight of his presence, the kind of authority that did not need to be announced. His eyes were sharp, a deep gray that seemed to study everything at once, and yet when he looked at her, something in his expression shifted, softened, like he was seeing something unexpected. "Are these yours?" he asked, his voice calm, deep, carrying easily across the space between them. Elira swallowed hard, suddenly aware of her bare feet, her wind-tossed hair, and the fact that she had just run through half a lavender field in a panic in front of a stranger, who was clearly someone important. "They are in my care," she said carefully, stepping forward. "I am sorry if they disturbed you." "They did not disturb me," he said. "They were quite convincing that I needed to hear about a frog they found yesterday." Fen nodded enthusiastically. It was green, and it jumped really far. Elira felt her cheeks warm, despite the tension still coiled in her chest. She crossed the remaining distance and knelt to check both pups, running her hands over their small shoulders and faces, making sure they were truly unharmed. Ren wrapped both arms around her neck immediately, and Fen pressed close against her side, and for a moment, the fear that had gripped her chest loosened its hold. "You should not run off like that," she whispered to them, though her voice trembled with relief rather than anger. "We heard the horses," Ren said simply, as if that explained everything. Elira looked up again at the man standing before her. Up close, she could see the fine details of his armor, the silver wolf emblem on his chest, and the way his men stood slightly behind him, alert but respectful. This was not a simple traveler. This was someone with power, someone whose presence changed the air around him. "You are not from Duskwood," she said carefully. "No," he answered. "I am here on matters concerning the border territories. My name is Castian." He did not offer a title, but something in the way his men shifted their stance told her there was more to that name than he was saying. She decided not to press. "Elira," she said, "I care for the pups at the orphanage near the field." Castian's gaze moved briefly to her feet, and she felt a flush of embarrassment rise up her neck. "You ran here without shoes," he observed. not unkindly. "I did not have time to think about shoes when I could not find them," she said, gesturing toward Ren and Fen. Something flickered across his face, an expression she could not quite place. Amusement, maybe, or something gentler. "Then let us walk you back," he said. "The field has stones near the tree line. It would not do for you to injure yourself after such bravery." She wanted to protest, to say she was fully capable of finding her own way home, but something about the calm certainty in his voice made the words die in her throat. Instead, she nodded, gathering Ren onto her hip, while Fen slipped his small hand into Castian's larger one, without hesitation, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Castian looked down at the boy's hand in his, and for a brief second, his expression grew distant, touched by something old and quiet, a memory perhaps, before he blinked, and the moment passed. They began walking back through the lavender field together, the sun beginning to lower in the sky, casting long golden light across the purple stalks. Castian's men followed a respectful distance behind, murmuring quietly among themselves, clearly unused to seeing their leader walk so slowly, so unhurried, matching his pace to a child's short legs. "You care for many pups at the orphanage?" Castian asked, breaking the silence. "6 in total," Alira said, "but Ren and Fen have been with me the longest. They came to us as infants." "No family came for them?" Alira shook her head. "No family ever does, in most cases. That is why the orphanage exists." Castian was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed ahead on the path. "It is admirable work," he said finally. "Difficult, and often unseen." Alira glanced at him sideways, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "Most people who passed through Duskwood barely noticed the orphanage at all, let alone spoke of it with respect." "Thank you," she said, "though I do not do it for recognition." "That is usually when recognition is most deserved," Castian said, and something in his voice made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. They walked on in comfortable silence, broken only by Fen occasionally pointing out interesting rocks or insects along the path, and Castian responding with patient attention to each one, as if the small boy's discoveries mattered as much as any matter of state. When they reached the edge of the orphanage grounds, an old stone building with ivy climbing its walls and smoke curling gently from its chimney, Castian stopped and released Fen's hand gently, crouching once more to meet the boy's eyes. "Thank you for telling me about the frog," he said seriously. Fen beamed, clearly delighted that a stranger with such an imposing presence had taken his story so seriously. Castian straightened and turned to Alira. "I hope the rest of your evening is calmer than its beginning." "I hope so as well," she said, managing a small smile despite the exhaustion settling into her limbs. "Thank you for bringing them back safely." "It was no trouble," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Your shoes. Where did you leave them?" Alira blinked, momentarily confused by the shift in topic. "By the lavender field, near the fence post. I was watching the pups there before they wandered off." Castian nodded slowly, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Then I hope you find them undisturbed," he said, and there was something in the careful way he said it that she did not think much of at the time, though she would remember it later. He gave a short nod to her, then turned and walked back toward his men, his dark cloak moving with the evening wind. Alira watched him go for a moment longer than she intended, before ushering the pups inside, her mind still turning over the strange, quiet warmth of the encounter. That night, after the pups were fed, bathed, and tucked into their small beds, Alira sat by the window of her room, staring out at the darkened lavender field beyond the orphanage fence. She thought of the stranger's gray eyes, the way he had crouched to speak with Fen as though nothing else in the world mattered in that moment, the quiet strength in his voice. She told herself it meant nothing. Travelers passed through Duskwood often enough, and most were gone within days, never to be seen again. There was no reason to think of Castian any differently. And yet, as she closed her eyes to sleep, she found herself wondering what business could possibly bring a man of his bearing to such a quiet border village, and why, of all the ways their meeting could have gone, it had left her feeling strangely unsettled, in a way she could not name. The next morning arrived gray and quiet, mist still clinging low to the lavender field, as Alira stepped outside to begin her chores. She had almost forgotten about her shoes until she reached the fence post where she had left them the day before, only to find the spot empty. She frowned, glancing around the immediate area, certain she had left them exactly there. The grass nearby was undisturbed, no signs of animals or wind having carried them off. It was as though they had simply vanished. Behind her, she heard the soft crunch of small feet on grass, and turned to see Wren and Fen standing a few paces away, both looking suspiciously innocent, their hands clasped tightly behind their backs. "Do either of you know where my shoes went?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. Wren's mismatched eyes widened with exaggerated confusion. "What shoes?" Fen, who had never been particularly good at hiding things, glanced quickly toward the far end of the lavender field, before catching himself and looking back at Alira with a wide, unconvincing smile. Alira crossed her arms, fighting back a smile of her own. "Fen, where are my shoes?" "I don't know," he said, his voice pitching slightly higher, the way it always did when he was not telling the truth. She sighed, deciding not to press further for the moment, though she made a mental note to check the field more carefully later. Whatever mischief the twins were planning, it seemed harmless enough for now, and there were far more pressing matters to attend to before the morning chores were finished. She did not yet know that this small, seemingly innocent act of mischief from two curious pups would set into motion a chain of events that would change the course of her life, far more than she could have imagined, drawing her back into the path of the gray-eyed stranger sooner than she expected, and far more often than either of them could have predicted. For now, she simply shook her head at the twins' poor attempt at innocence, gathered them close, and turned back toward the orphanage, her bare feet once again pressing against the cool morning grass, unaware that somewhere across the field, in a camp of quiet tents and watchful soldiers, a king who had not smiled in longer than he could remember, was already thinking of finding a reason to see her again. Castian stood at the edge of his camp, staring at a pair of small, worn shoes sitting neatly on a folded blanket inside his tent, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had no idea what to do next. His second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Doran, stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching his king with an expression somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "You want to explain to me how the Omega's shoes ended up in your personal tent?" "I do not know," Castian admitted, and the honesty of it surprised even him. "I woke to find them here." "The pups," Doran said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "They have been sneaking through the camp perimeter since yesterday. My scouts spotted them twice last night." Castian looked down at the shoes again, small and plain, clearly worn from years of use rather than luxury. There was something oddly grounding about them, a reminder that not everyone in this world carried themselves with armor and titles. He thought of the woman who had run barefoot through a field to find two missing children without a moment's hesitation for her own safety, and something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the border dispute he had traveled here to resolve. "Return them," he said finally. "You could send one of the men," Doran suggested, a knowing edge creeping into his voice. "I will take them myself," Castian said, ignoring the look his second gave him. He had come to Duskwood for one reason only, to investigate reports of an ancient pack relic believed to have been smuggled through this border territory, a piece of history tied to old bloodlines and older conflicts between neighboring kingdoms. It was delicate work, requiring discretion, and he had no intention of drawing attention to his presence here any longer than necessary. And yet, as he picked up the small shoes and began walking toward the lavender field, he found himself unable to stop thinking about the way Alira's voice had softened when she spoke to the pups, the way her exhaustion had not once turned to impatience, despite clearly having had a difficult morning. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him the way she had, not with fear or calculated respect, but simply as a person standing in front of her, momentarily inconvenienced by circumstance. He had almost forgotten what that felt like. The lavender field was quiet when he arrived, the morning mist having burned away to reveal rows of purple stalks swaying gently under a pale blue sky. He found Alira near the far end, gathering fresh lavender into a woven basket, her sleeves rolled up and her hair tied back loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She looked up as he approached, surprise flickering across her features before settling into something more guarded. "Your Grace," she began, clearly having learned more about his identity since their last meeting. "Castian is fine," he said, holding out the shoes. "I believe these belong to you." Elira's eyes widened slightly as she took them, glancing briefly toward the orphanage in the distance, where two small figures could be seen peering out from behind a window curtain, clearly not as discreet as they believed themselves to be. "I am sorry," she said, setting the basket down to properly hold the shoes. "They must have taken them and left them somewhere near your camp. I did not think they would go that far." "They did not cause any trouble," Castian said, though my second-in-command seemed quite entertained by the mystery. A small, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of Elira's mouth. "They have always had a habit of finding their way into places they should not be. I apologize again." "There is no need," he said. It was not an unpleasant surprise. They stood there for a moment, neither quite sure what to say next, the space between them filled with the soft rustle of lavender in the breeze. Castian found himself reluctant to leave, though he could not fully explain why. "You are researching something in Duskwood," Elira said finally, her tone careful, testing. "The pack elders have been speaking of a king traveling with a small envoy, though none seem certain of your true purpose." Castian considered his words carefully before answering. "There are matters of history tied to this territory that concern my kingdom. I am simply here to understand them better." It was not a lie, though it was far from the complete truth, and something in her expression told him she sensed there was more beneath his careful phrasing. To her credit, she did not press further. "I hope you find what you are looking for," she said instead, and there was a genuine warmth in her voice that caught him off guard. "As do I," he said, though in that moment, standing in a field of lavender across from a woman who had run barefoot to save two children, without a second thought for herself, he found himself less certain than ever what exactly he was searching for. Before he could say more, a small voice called out from across the field. Wren had abandoned all pretense of hiding, and was now running toward them at full speed, her twin following closely behind, both children clearly unable to resist witnessing the outcome of their scheme in person. "Did you like the frog story?" Fen asked breathlessly, as he skidded to a stop in front of Castian. "I have thought of it several times since yesterday," Castian said seriously, and the boy's face lit up with pure delight. Elira watched the exchange with a mixture of exasperation and fondness, shaking her head slightly. "I promise, they are usually better behaved than this." "I find I do not mind the exception," Castian said, and the words came out more honest than he intended. Their eyes met for a brief moment, something unspoken passing between them, before Elira cleared her throat and looked away, busying herself with gathering her basket once more. "I should return to my duties," she said. "The pups will need their morning lessons soon." "Of course," Castian said, though something in him wished for a reason to extend the conversation further. As she gathered the twins and began walking back toward the orphanage, Fen turned back briefly and waved enthusiastically, and Castian found himself raising a hand in return before he had even fully decided to do so. He remained standing in the lavender field long after they had disappeared from view, the scent of purple blooms still hanging heavy in the air around him, and for the first time since arriving in Duskwood, the weight of his true purpose here felt strangely distant, replaced instead by a quiet curiosity about a barefoot Omega with tired eyes and an unguarded heart. That evening, as his men prepared their evening meal around the campfire, Doran approached him with a knowing look, settling onto a nearby log without invitation. "You returned the shoes yourself," he said. "I did," Castian replied, not looking up from the map spread across his lap, though his attention was clearly elsewhere. "And you spoke with her for quite some time, from what my scouts tell me." Castian finally looked up, meeting his second's amused expression with a level stare. "Do your scouts have nothing better to report than my conversations in a lavender field?" Doran chuckled, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Forgive me. It has simply been a long time since I have seen you smile at anyone, let alone an Omega caretaker from a border village." Castian did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting toward the darkened tree line beyond the camp, where somewhere past the fields and forests, a stone orphanage stood quiet under the evening sky. "It has been a long time," he admitted finally, so quietly that Doran almost did not hear it. "For many things." Doran's expression softened, the teasing edge fading from his voice. "There is no shame in that, Castian. Even kings are allowed to remember how to feel something other than duty." Castian did not answer, but he did not disagree either. And long after the fire had burned low and his men had retired to their tents, he remained awake, staring up at the stars, his mind returning again and again to a pair of mismatched eyes, a shy, silent boy who had finally found his voice, and the woman who had given both of them a home when no one else would. 3 days passed, and in that time, the shoes vanished twice more. The first time, Elira found them perched carefully on top of a fence post near the orphanage garden, tied together with a piece of twine that had clearly been knotted by small, determined hands. The second time, they were missing entirely for nearly a full day, only to reappear that evening sitting outside the orphanage door, along with a small bundle of fresh lavender tied with the same twine. She had her suspicions about who was responsible, though the twins remained remarkably tight-lipped whenever she asked, exchanging quick glances between themselves before insisting they knew nothing at all. It was on the 4th day that she finally caught them in the act. She had gone out early to check on the garden before the morning chores began, only to spot Wren and Fen crouched near the fence, whispering urgently to one another while Fen clutched something small and worn behind his back. "What do you have there?" Elira asked, crossing her arms as she approached. The twins froze, caught completely off guard, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, clearly trying to formulate an excuse between them through nothing but panicked eye contact. "Nothing," Fen finally said, though his voice cracked slightly on the single word. Elira held out her hand expectantly, and after a moment of visible internal struggle, Fen reluctantly revealed one of her shoes, looking thoroughly ashamed of himself. "You two have been taking my shoes on purpose," she said, though there was no real anger in her voice, only tired amusement. Wren, apparently deciding that honesty was now the only remaining option, spoke up quickly. "We just wanted him to come back." Elira blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected admission. "Who?" "The tall man," Wren said, as though it were obvious. "Castian. He tells good stories, and he listens really good, and when your shoes go missing, he comes to bring them back, and then you talk to him, and you smile more when he is here." Elira felt her cheeks flush warm, despite the cool morning air. "I do not smile more when he is here." Fen tilted his head, studying her with the unfiltered honesty that only small children seemed capable of. "You do. Your face gets soft, like when you sing to me at night." Elira opened her mouth to argue further, then closed it again, unable to find a suitable response to such a direct observation from a 6-year-old. She sighed instead, kneeling down to meet both children at eye level. "Even if that were true," she said carefully, "it is not right to keep taking my shoes without asking. Castian has important matters to attend to. He cannot spend all his time chasing after missing shoes." "He doesn't seem to mind," Wren pointed out, with the kind of stubborn logic that made arguing with her nearly impossible. Elira sighed again, taking the shoe from Fen's hands and holding both of them close for a moment. "I understand you like him. He has been kind to you both, but we cannot keep tricking him just because it makes you happy. That would not be fair to him." The twins exchanged a guilty glance, clearly beginning to understand the weight of their scheme, though neither looked particularly repentant. "Will you still let us see him sometimes?" Fen asked quietly. Elira hesitated, surprised by how much the question affected her, and by how quickly her mind supplied an answer she had not expected to feel so strongly about. "That is not really up to me," she said finally. "Castian has his own responsibilities. He will not be in Duskwood forever." The thought settled uncomfortably in her chest as she said it, heavier than she anticipated, though she pushed the feeling aside as she ushered the twins back inside for their morning lessons. She did not know that later that same day, Castian would find himself once again standing outside the orphanage, this time not because of missing shoes, but because his investigation into the missing relic had led him directly to Duskwood's oldest pack elder, a woman who lived in a small cottage just beyond the lavender field, close enough that he could see the orphanage rooftop from her doorstep. The elder, a sharp-eyed woman named Ivy, with silver hair pulled into a tight braid, studied Castian carefully as she poured tea into 2 chipped cups, her movements slow and deliberate. "You are not the first to come searching for that relic," she said finally, setting the teapot down. "Others have come through these lands before, though none carried themselves quite like you." "What can you tell me about it?" Castian asked, keeping his tone even, despite the urgency he felt beneath the surface. Ivy's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him for a long moment before she spoke again. The relic you seek was entrusted to this territory generations ago, hidden to prevent it from being used for purposes it was never meant to serve. If you are truly here to protect it, rather than claim it for your own kingdom's gain, then perhaps I can help you. I have no intention of misusing it, Castian said firmly. There are those within my own court who would see it used to consolidate power in ways that would harm more than protect. I intend to ensure it remains where it cannot be exploited. Ivy studied him for a long moment longer, then nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with what she saw in his expression. Then perhaps fate has brought you to the right place, for more reasons than the relic alone. Castian frowned slightly at the cryptic comment. What do you mean? Ivy's lips curved into a small, knowing smile as she glanced briefly out the window toward the lavender field beyond. You have been spending considerable time near the orphanage, from what I hear. Castian felt an unfamiliar warmth rise to his face, quickly schooling his expression back into neutrality. I have simply been returning misplaced items. Of course, Ivy said, her tone light with amusement. Elira is a good woman, strong, though she does not always believe it herself. She has carried more than her share of burdens since she came to us. Castian's curiosity sharpened at the mention of her past, though he hesitated to pry into matters that were not his to ask about. Ivy, seeming to sense his restraint, continued anyway. She was meant for another life once, Ivy said quietly. A political match, arranged when she was very young, to a man who cared more for power than for her well-being. When she discovered the truth of his intentions, she fled, rather than bind herself to a life built on betrayal. It cost her greatly among her own kind, but she never once regretted the choice. Castian absorbed this information slowly, feeling something shift within him, an unexpected kinship forming with a woman he barely knew, both of them carrying the weight of choices made to escape lives that others had tried to force upon them. She does not speak of it, Ivy added. But I thought you should understand the woman you have been so quick to defend with your presence, even if you have not yet admitted it to yourself. Castian did not respond immediately, his mind turning over the new information as he finished the last of his tea. When he finally rose to leave, Ivy caught his arm gently, her expression turning serious once more. The relic you seek is hidden beneath the roots of the oldest tree at the edge of the lavender field, she said quietly. Few know this, and I trust you to protect that knowledge as carefully as you intend to protect what lies beneath it. Castian nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of the trust being placed in him. You have my word. As he left Ivy's cottage and made his way back toward his camp, his path took him once again along the edge of the lavender field, and it was there that he spotted Elira sitting alone near the old oak tree at the field's edge, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out at the swaying purple stalks, with a distant expression on her face. He hesitated for a moment, uncertain whether to approach or leave her to her thoughts, but something in her posture, the quiet weight she seemed to be carrying, made him unable to simply walk away. May I sit? He asked softly, approaching slowly enough to give her time to object if she wished. Elira looked up, startled from her thoughts, before nodding and shifting slightly to make room beside her. Of course. They sat together in silence for a long moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the field, the scent of lavender thick in the warm air between them. The twins told me why they kept taking my shoes, she said finally, a small, rueful smile touching her lips. They wanted an excuse to see you again. Castian felt something warm settle in his chest at the admission, though he kept his voice carefully light. I confess, I did not mind the excuse either. Elira glanced sideways at him, something vulnerable flickering behind her eyes, before she looked away again, back toward the field. You will not be here forever, she said quietly, echoing the same thought that had troubled her earlier that morning. Castian was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. No, he admitted, I have responsibilities that will eventually call me elsewhere, but I find myself in no particular hurry to leave, for the first time in a long while. Elira turned to look at him fully then, searching his expression as though trying to determine whether he truly meant what he had said. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because the tension in her shoulders eased slightly, and a small, genuine smile finally broke through. The pups will be pleased to hear that, she said softly. And you? Castian asked, his voice quieter than he intended, more honest than he had allowed himself to be with anyone in a very long time. Illyra held his gaze for a long moment, the weight of the question settling between them, heavier and more meaningful than either of them had expected it to be. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would be pleased as well." The sun continued its slow descent behind the lavender field, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and gold, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the quiet space between two guarded hearts felt just a little less lonely. News traveled quickly through small villages, and Duskwood was no exception. Within days, whispers began circulating among the pack members about the visiting king, who had been spending his afternoons near the orphanage, rather than attending to the diplomatic matters that were supposedly the reason for his visit. Illyra noticed the sideways glances from villagers as she went about her errands, the way conversations sometimes quieted when she passed, though no one said anything directly to her face. She tried not to let it bother her, focusing instead on her daily routine with the pups, but the growing attention made her increasingly aware of just how unusual her situation with Castian had become. It was Talia, one of the few pack members who had remained kind to her since her arrival in Duskwood years ago, who finally addressed the matter directly one afternoon, while helping Illyra hang laundry outside the orphanage. "People are talking," Talia said carefully, not looking up from the shirt she was pinning to the line. "About what?" Illyra asked, though she already suspected the answer. "About you and the king," Talia said. "Some say it is improper for an Omega of no standing to be spending so much time with someone of his position. Others simply find it curious." Illyra felt a familiar tightness form in her chest, the same defensive instinct that had protected her since she fled her arranged match years ago. "We have simply spoken a few times. There is nothing improper about it." Talia glanced at her then, a knowing look softening her expression. "I did not say I believed there was anything improper, Illyra. I am only telling you what others are saying, so you are not caught off guard by it." Illyra sighed, setting down the basket of laundry and rubbing her temples. "I did not ask for any of this attention. I was simply returning a favor when he brought the twins back safely, and things continued from there, without my intending them to." "Do you regret it?" Talia asked gently. Illyra considered the question carefully, thinking of Castian's quiet patience with the pups, the way he had listened to Ivy's history of Duskwood, with genuine respect, the warmth in his gray eyes, when he had asked if she would be pleased by his continued presence. "No," she admitted finally. "I do not regret it, even if I probably should." Talia smiled softly, resuming her work with the laundry. "Then do not let the whispers of others convince you otherwise. You have spent enough years living carefully to avoid scandal, Illyra. Perhaps it is time you allowed yourself something that makes you happy, regardless of what others think." Illyra did not respond immediately, but she found herself considering Talia's words carefully as the afternoon wore on, turning them over in her mind even as she prepared dinner for the pups and settled them into bed for the evening. That night, as she sat by her window once again, staring out at the darkened lavender field, she saw a familiar figure approaching along the path, moving with the same quiet confidence she had come to recognize even from a distance. She met Castian at the orphanage gate, wrapping a light shawl around her shoulders against the cool evening air. "It is late for a visit," she said, though there was no real reproach in her tone. "I could not sleep," Castian admitted. "I found myself wanting to see you, even briefly." Illyra felt her heart flutter at the admission, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "The pack has begun talking about us," she said carefully, watching his reaction closely. Something flickered across Castian's face, a mixture of concern and something more resolute. "What are they saying?" "That it is improper for someone of my standing to spend so much time with someone of yours," she said honestly. "That an Omega, with no political value, should not be receiving such attention from a king." Castian's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment, Illyra could see the weight of frustration behind his carefully controlled expression. "Your standing has nothing to do with your worth, Illyra. I would think less of anyone who believed otherwise." "That is easy to say," she said quietly, "but not everyone shares that view. Your own people may not welcome someone like me, regardless of how you feel." Castian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers. "I have spent much of my life doing what was expected of me, Illyra. Ruling with duty above all else, making decisions based on what would maintain peace and stability, even when it meant sacrificing my own wishes. I do not intend to let the opinions of others dictate this particular matter." Alira searched his expression, looking for any hint of uncertainty, but found only quiet determination. "You barely know me," she said softly. "I know enough," Castian said. "I know that you ran barefoot through a field, without hesitation, to find 2 children who were not even your own by blood. I know that you have carried the weight of caring for others your entire life, while asking for nothing in return. I know that despite everything you have been through, you still choose kindness over bitterness, every single day. That tells me more about your character than any title or bloodline ever could." Alira felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, though she blinked them back quickly. No one had ever spoken to her with such open sincerity, such complete disregard for the social boundaries that had defined so much of her life since she fled her arranged match. "I do not know what to say to that," she admitted quietly. "You do not need to say anything," Castian said gently. "I only wanted you to know that whatever whispers reach your ears, they do not reflect my own feelings on the matter." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the cool night air settling around them, the distant sound of crickets filling the space between their words. Eventually, Castian reached out, hesitating only briefly, before gently taking her hand in his. "I should return to my camp before my absence is noticed," he said softly, though he made no immediate move to release her hand. "But I wanted you to know, regardless of what tomorrow brings, that tonight was worth the walk." Alira squeezed his hand gently in return, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her earlier worry. "Good night, Castian." "Good night, Alira." She watched him walk back toward the tree line, until his figure disappeared into the darkness, and for a long time afterward, she remained standing at the gate, her hand still tingling faintly from his touch, her heart caught somewhere between fear and hope for what might come next. She did not yet know that within the walls of Castian's own kingdom, far beyond the borders of Duskwood, certain members of his court had already begun receiving reports of his prolonged stay, and that not all of them viewed his growing attachment to an Omega caretaker, of no political standing, with anything resembling the openness he had just shown her. The peace of that quiet evening, however brief, was the calm before a storm neither of them could yet see approaching. Ren and Fen had not stopped their scheming, even after Alira's stern talk about honesty. If anything, learning that their plan had actually worked only encouraged them further, though they had shifted their methods to something slightly less obvious than simply hiding shoes. Now, they had taken to inviting Castian directly, slipping away during his visits to whisper suggestions about picnics near the old oak tree, or insisting that he simply must see the new baby rabbits that had been born in the garden, always finding some small reason to ensure he and Alira spent time together, even if it meant conveniently disappearing themselves at just the right moment. Castian found their efforts endlessly amusing, playing along more often than not, secretly grateful for any excuse that allowed him to spend more time in Alira's presence, without the added weight of announcing his intentions outright. Doran had taken to teasing him relentlessly about it, though even his second-in-command had begun to soften toward the idea, watching his king smile more freely than he had in years. It was on one such afternoon, during what the twins had insisted was an urgent matter, involving a very important rock they had found near the field's edge, that Castian and Alira found themselves alone together, while Ren and Fen searched for a second matching rock that clearly did not exist. "They are not being subtle," Alira said, watching the twins pretend to search through the grass a short distance away, glancing back at the 2 adults every few seconds to check on their progress. "No," Castian agreed, settling onto the grass beside her. "Though I find I do not mind their lack of subtlety." Alira laughed softly, the sound light and genuine, and Castian found himself thinking, not for the first time, that he could listen to that sound for the rest of his life, without growing tired of it. "They have decided you belong to our family now," Alira said, a teasing note in her voice, though something more serious lingered beneath it. "I hope that does not overstep any boundaries." Castian turned to look at her fully, his expression softening. "It does not overstep anything, Alira. If anything, I find myself hoping it might become true." Alira's breath caught slightly at the directness of his words, her eyes searching his face for any hint of hesitation, finding none. "Castian," she said softly, "you are a king. Eventually you will need to return to your kingdom, to your responsibilities. What happens to whatever this is between us when that day comes? Castian was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully before speaking. I had thought long about this before I ever allowed myself to grow close to you, he admitted. I told myself it would be easier to remain distant, to focus only on my mission here and return home without complication. But every time I tried to keep that distance, I found myself drawn back regardless. He reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering softly against her cheek. I do not wish to leave Duskwood without you, Alira. Whatever that means for both our lives, I am willing to face it, if you are willing to consider it alongside me. Alira felt her heart pound heavily in her chest, overwhelmed by the weight and sincerity of his words. You barely know what my life has been, she said quietly. The reasons I fled my first arranged match, the reputation I carry because of it. Then tell me, Castian said gently. I want to understand, if you are willing to share it. Alira took a deep breath, gathering her courage before finally speaking the truth she had carried alone for so many years. When I was young, my family arranged a match for me, with a man from a neighboring pack, believing it would strengthen our territory's standing. I did not love him, but I accepted it as my duty, believing it was simply the way things were meant to be. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the lavender field as the memories resurfaced. It was only after the match was formalized that I discovered his true intentions. He had been using the arrangement to gain access to information about our pack's defenses, planning to hand it over to a rival territory in exchange for personal gain. When I confronted him, he made it clear that my well-being had never mattered to him at all, only what he could gain through our union. Castian's expression darkened with quiet anger on her behalf, though he remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. I fled before the betrayal could be carried out, Alira continued. I warned my family, and the plot was stopped, but the damage to my reputation was already done. Many believed I had simply grown afraid of commitment, or worse, that I had somehow been complicit in his schemes before turning against him for my own gain. My family, ashamed of the scandal, distanced themselves from me, and I was left with very few who still trusted my word. That is why you came to Duskwood, Castian said softly, understanding dawning in his expression. Alira nodded. I needed somewhere to start over, somewhere my past would not follow me so closely. The pack here took me in, though I remained something of an outsider even among them, never quite trusted the way others were. Caring for the orphans became my purpose, the one thing I could pour myself into without fear of further betrayal. You showed more courage in that single choice than most people demonstrate in their entire lives, Alira. You risked everything to protect your family and your pack, even knowing it would cost you your reputation and your place among them. That is not something to be ashamed of. It is something to be honored. Tears welled in Alira's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, the weight of years spent believing herself somehow tainted by a betrayal that had never truly been her fault, finally beginning to lift under the warmth of his understanding. Thank you, she whispered, for believing me without hesitation. I would believe you in anything, Castian said simply, and the certainty in his voice left no room for doubt. They sat together for a long while after that, hands intertwined, the weight of old wounds beginning to heal in the quiet comfort of shared understanding. It was Castian, eventually, who broke the silence again, his own voice growing quieter, more vulnerable than she had yet heard it. I have not spoken of my own losses to anyone in a long time, he admitted, not even to Doran, who has stood beside me through most of it. Alira turned to look at him fully, giving him her complete attention, sensing the significance of what he was about to share. I was matched once as well, Castian said slowly, not through arrangement, but through genuine choice. Her name was Celine. We trained together as pack warriors before I ever took the throne, and our bond grew naturally over many years. His voice grew heavier as he continued. She died in battle, defending our territory during a conflict with a rival kingdom shortly after I was crowned. I was not there when it happened. I had been called away to handle matters elsewhere, believing the front line secure. By the time I returned, it was already too late. Alira squeezed his hand gently, offering silent comfort as he continued. I blamed myself for a long time afterward, Castian admitted, believing that if I had remained, I could have prevented her death. It took years before I allowed myself to move past that guilt, enough to function as a ruler again, let alone consider opening my heart to anyone else. It was not your fault, Elira said softly, echoing back to him, the same reassurance he had offered her moments before. Castian gave a small, sad smile. I know that now, though it took a very long time to believe it. I share this with you, not to burden you with old grief, but because I want you to understand why I have remained guarded for so long, and why what I am feeling now, with you, feels so significant. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. I did not expect to feel this way again, Elira. Not after Celine. But you have brought something back to life in me that I believed had died alongside her. Elira felt tears slip freely down her cheeks now, though they were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief at finally being seen and understood so completely by someone who had faced his own share of pain and loss. In the distance, Ren and Fen had long since abandoned their pretense of searching for a matching rock, instead sitting quietly together beneath a nearby tree, watching the two adults with wide, hopeful eyes, seemingly aware that something important was unfolding, even if they did not fully understand the depth of it. Neither Elira nor Castian noticed the twins watching, too absorbed in the fragile, healing warmth passing between them, two wounded hearts slowly finding their way back to trust, one honest confession at a time. A rider arrived at Castian's camp 3 days later, dust-covered and breathless from hard travel, carrying a sealed letter bearing the crest of the Silvermoon Court. Doran brought it directly to Castian's tent, his expression grim in a way that immediately put the king on alert. This came from Corin, Doran said, referring to one of the senior council members who remained at Silvermoon in Castian's absence. He would not have sent a rider this far unless the matter was urgent. Castian broke the seal and read quickly, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he set the letter down heavily, his jaw tight with barely controlled frustration. What does it say? Doran asked. Word has reached the council of my continued presence in Duskwood, far beyond what my original mission required, Castian said. Corin writes that certain members of the court have begun questioning my judgment, believing I have become distracted from matters of state by personal interests, unbefitting a king. Doran's expression hardened. They know about Elira. It appears so, Castian confirmed. Corin warns that a faction led by Councilman Osric has begun making inquiries into her background, seeking any information that could be used to discredit her, or to pressure me into abandoning whatever connection I have formed here. Osric has never approved of anyone he could not control, Doran said darkly. He will see any potential mate you choose outside his preferred political alliances as a threat to his own influence. Castian rose from his seat, pacing the length of his tent, his mind racing through possible outcomes. If Osric discovers the details of Elira's past, the failed match, the scandal surrounding her departure from her previous pack, he will use it against her without hesitation, regardless of the truth behind those events. Then we must act before he does, Doran said firmly. What do you intend to do? Castian stopped pacing, his expression settling into the calm, resolute look Doran recognized from countless difficult decisions throughout their years serving together. I intend to make my intentions known clearly and publicly, before Osric has the chance to twist the narrative to his own advantage. If Elira is to face scrutiny from my court, she will face it as someone I have openly chosen to protect, not as a secret to be exposed and exploited. Doran nodded slowly, though concern remained evident in his expression. That will not be a simple matter, Castian. Osric has allies within the council who will not welcome an Omega, of no political standing, being elevated to a position of influence within the kingdom. I am aware of the difficulty, Castian said, but I will not allow fear of political backlash to dictate matters of the heart, not again. I made that mistake once already, prioritizing duty above all else, and it cost me dearly. I will not repeat it. Meanwhile, in Duskwood, Elira remained blissfully unaware of the political storm, quietly gathering around her, her days continuing much as they had before, filled with the simple routines of caring for the pups and tending to her small garden. It was only when a stranger arrived at the orphanage gate one afternoon, dressed in fine traveling clothes that clearly marked him as someone from beyond the village, that the first signs of trouble began to reach her directly. The man introduced himself as Halden, claiming to represent interests within the Silvermoon Court, though his manner was cold and probing rather than diplomatic. He asked pointed questions about her past, her family, the circumstances surrounding her departure from her previous pack, framing his inquiries in ways that made her increasingly uneasy. "Why are you asking me these things?" Alira finally demanded, her patience wearing thin after nearly an hour of increasingly invasive questions. Halden's expression remained carefully neutral, though something calculating flickered behind his eyes. "There are those within the Silver Moon Court who wish to understand the full character of anyone who might be growing close to their king. Surely you can understand the importance of such diligence, given his position." Alira felt a chill settle over her at the implication behind his words. "If you have concerns about my character, you are welcome to ask me directly, rather than circling the matter with implications." "Very well," Halden said, his tone growing sharper. "It has come to our attention that you fled a previous match, under circumstances involving accusations of betrayal. Some believe you may have been complicit in a plot against your own pack, before turning on your intended match, to save yourself from consequence." Alira's blood ran cold at hearing her worst fears, about how her past might be twisted, finally spoken aloud, by a stranger, with clear intentions to use them against her. "That is not what happened," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and old unhealed pain. "I discovered his betrayal and stopped it. I did not participate in any plot." "Perhaps," Halden said, though his tone made clear he did not believe her, or did not care to. "But perception matters greatly within the court, and such accusations, true or not, could prove quite damaging to anyone associated with you." "Is that a threat?" Alira asked sharply. "Merely an observation," Halden said smoothly, rising from his seat. "I trust you will consider carefully the wisdom of continuing an association that could bring such scrutiny upon yourself and upon those you claim to protect." He left without further explanation, leaving Alira sitting alone in stunned, frightened silence, her hands trembling as the weight of what had just happened settled fully upon her. That evening, when Castian arrived for his usual visit, he immediately sensed something was wrong, finding Alira unusually withdrawn, her eyes red-rimmed from tears she had clearly been trying to hide. "What happened?" he asked gently, taking her hands in his. Haltingly, Alira recounted the visit from Halden, the pointed accusations about her past, the thinly veiled threats about what continued association with Castian might cost her. As she spoke, she watched anger build steadily behind Castian's carefully controlled expression. "This is Osric's doing," he said grimly, once she finished. "I am so sorry, Alira. I did not intend for you to become a target of court politics, before I had the chance to properly address the matter myself." "Perhaps he is right," Alira said quietly, fear creeping into her voice. "Perhaps continuing this, whatever this is between us, will only bring more danger, not just to me, but to the pups as well. I cannot risk their safety for my own happiness." Castian's expression softened, though his voice remained firm. "Alira, look at me. I will not allow anyone to threaten you, or the children in your care, regardless of their position within my court. I made a promise to protect what matters, and I intend to keep it, whatever it costs politically." "You cannot promise that," Alira said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You cannot control every threat that might come from your own court." "No," Castian admitted, "but I can promise that I will not abandon you out of fear of what others might say or do. I have spent enough of my life allowing duty and political convenience to dictate my choices. I will not make that mistake with you." Alira searched his eyes, looking for any hint of uncertainty, finding only unwavering resolve. Slowly the fear in her chest began to ease, replaced by a fragile but growing trust in the strength of his conviction. "What do we do now?" she asked quietly. "Now," Castian said, "I ensure that Osric and anyone else who dares threaten you understand precisely who they are dealing with." The following morning, Castian sent word ahead to Silvermoon, announcing his intention to formally declare his relationship with Alira before the full council upon his return, making clear that any attempts to discredit or threaten her would be treated as a direct challenge to his authority as king. The declaration set the court ablaze with speculation and controversy, exactly as he had anticipated, and though it provided a temporary measure of protection through open acknowledgement, it also drew Osric's faction into more direct, more dangerous action than either Castian or Alira could have anticipated. The fire started just after midnight. Alira woke to the sharp smell of smoke, and the sound of frantic barking from the pack dogs kept near the orphanage's back shed. She bolted upright, her heart slamming against her ribs as she raced to the window, and what she saw outside stole the breath from her lungs entirely. Flames were licking up the side of the garden shed, spreading fast toward the fence line that separated the yard from the main building. Thick black smoke curled upward into the night sky, illuminated orange by the fire's growing hunger. "Ren, Fen," she screamed, sprinting from her room to the small bedroom the twins shared, throwing the door open and scooping them both from their beds in one motion, ignoring their sleepy, confused protests. "What's happening?" Ren asked, coughing slightly, as smoke began creeping into the hallway. "We need to get outside, now," Elira said, her voice sharp with barely controlled panic, as she hurried both children toward the front door, gathering the 4 other orphans from their rooms along the way, ushering all 6 children out into the cool night air, just as flames began licking at the edge of the roofline. Once outside, she counted heads frantically, relief flooding through her as she confirmed all 6 children were safe, though the terror of how close they had come to disaster left her hands shaking uncontrollably. It was Talia, running from the nearby cottage with several other villagers, who first spotted the source of the fire more clearly. "There!" she shouted, pointing toward a shadowy figure fleeing across the field toward the tree line. "Someone set this deliberately." Elira's blood ran cold as understanding dawned. This was no accident. This was Osric's faction, following through on the threat implied during Halden's visit days before. Word reached Castian's camp within minutes, carried by a breathless village runner who had seen the flames from a distance. Castian was on his feet and moving, before the runner had even finished speaking, calling for his men to follow as he sprinted toward Duskwood, his heart pounding with a fear more intense than anything he had felt since the day he lost Celine. He arrived to find the shed fully engulfed, villagers working frantically to douse the flames before they could spread further, and Elira standing at the center of it all, surrounded by 6 frightened children, her face pale with shock, but her posture fiercely protective. "Elira," he called, rushing to her side, his hands immediately checking over her and the children for any sign of injury. "We are safe," she said, though her voice trembled. "Someone did this on purpose, Castian." Talia saw them fleeing toward the trees. Castian's expression turned to stone, cold fury replacing the fear that had driven him here. "This ends now," he said grimly, turning to Doran, who had arrived alongside the other soldiers. "Find whoever did this. I want them brought before me immediately." It took less than an hour for Castian's men to track down the culprit, a low-ranking court agent, who had been dispatched by Osric himself with explicit instructions to frighten Elira into ending her association with the king, though the fire had grown far more dangerous than the agent had apparently intended, nearly costing the lives of 6 innocent children in the process. Castian stood before the captured agent, his voice cold and controlled, in a way that made even his own soldiers uneasy. "You will tell me everything Osric instructed you to do, and you will do so honestly, or you will face consequences far beyond what your original mission anticipated." The frightened agent, faced with the full weight of a king's fury, directed squarely at him, confessed everything within minutes, detailing Osric's plan to use fear and intimidation to force Elira's withdrawal from Castian's life, believing it would prevent what he viewed as a threat to established political alliances within the court. "This goes beyond simple political disagreement," Castian said, once the confession was complete, his voice carrying to every soldier and villager gathered nearby. "This was an attack on innocent children, orchestrated by a member of my own council. It will not go unanswered." He turned to Elira then, his expression softening from cold fury to fierce protective determination. "I am done allowing fear of political consequence to dictate the safety of those I care for. Osric will answer for this before the full council, and I will ensure protections are put in place, so nothing like this can ever threaten you or these children again." Elira, still shaken from the night's events, found herself steadied by the unwavering resolve in his voice. "What will happen now?" she asked quietly. "Now," Castian said, "I return to Silvermoon to address this directly, and I do not intend to return alone." The weight of his meaning was not lost on her, and despite the fear and exhaustion of the night's events, something warm and hopeful began to grow steadily in her chest. Over the following days, as the orphanage began the slow process of rebuilding the damaged shed, with help from the entire village. Word spread quickly of what had happened, and Castian's response to it. Rather than diminishing his standing among his own people, as Osric had likely hoped, the incident instead galvanized significant support for Castian's position, as details of the councilman's reckless endangerment of innocent children reached ears throughout both Duskwood and Silvermoon alike. Ivy, the pack elder who had first shared Alira's history with Castian, arrived at the rebuilding site one afternoon, her expression grave but resolute. This attack, terrible as it was, may prove to be exactly what forces the council to finally address Osric's overreach, she said to Castian as they surveyed the progress being made. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal a truth that has long been ignored. I would have preferred a less dangerous method of revealing it, Castian said grimly, watching Alira across the yard, helping the children clear debris from the damaged garden, her resilience evident despite everything she had endured. Perhaps, Ivy agreed, but do not let guilt over what happened distract you from what must be done now. Alira and these children need protection that only your full authority can provide. Do not hesitate simply because the path forward feels uncertain. Castian nodded slowly, understanding the truth in her words, even as worry continued to gnaw at him about what challenges still lay ahead in confronting Osric's faction directly. He knew this was far from over, that the councilman would not simply accept defeat without further attempts to protect his own position and influence. But as he watched Alira laugh softly at something Fen said, her strength and warmth undiminished despite the terror of recent events, he found his resolve only growing stronger. Whatever battles remained ahead, whatever political storms he would need to weather upon his return to Silvermoon, he knew with absolute certainty that he would face them all, so long as it meant protecting the fragile, precious family that had somehow found its way into his heart. Despite the outpouring of support following the fire, Alira found herself increasingly consumed by fear in the days that followed, a fear that had nothing to do with flames or smoke, and everything to do with the weight of what a future alongside Castian might truly demand of her. She sat alone in the garden late one evening, watching the rebuilt shed standing solid and whole once more against the darkening sky, and yet she felt anything but settled. The attack had been meant for her, a direct consequence of her association with Castian, and it had nearly cost the lives of 6 children who depended entirely on her for their safety and well-being. What if next time she would not be so fortunate? What if the danger reached further than a single shed, threatening the children themselves, or spreading beyond Duskwood to endanger the entire village that had taken her in when no one else would? The thought was unbearable, and by the time Castian arrived for his evening visit, Alira had convinced herself of what needed to be done, however much it broke her heart to consider it. "You seem troubled," Castian said gently, settling beside her on the garden bench. "Castian," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I think we need to reconsider what we are doing." His expression shifted immediately, concern replacing the warmth that had greeted her moments before. "What do you mean?" "The fire," she said, forcing herself to continue despite the pain building in her chest. "It happened because of me. Because of us. Those children could have died, Castian. I cannot risk that again. I cannot allow my own happiness to endanger the very people I am meant to protect." "Alira," Castian said firmly, "the fire happened because of Osric's cruelty and overreach, not because of anything you did wrong. Punishing yourself, or ending what we have built together, will not undo what happened, nor will it prevent future threats. If anything, it only allows fear to win." "But what if it happens again?" Alira asked, tears finally breaking free. "What if next time I am not fast enough, or the danger comes from somewhere I cannot anticipate? I cannot bear the thought of losing any of them, because I chose my own heart over their safety." Castian reached for her hands, holding them firmly despite her attempt to pull away. "Listen to me, Alira. I understand your fear, truly I do. But running from this, from us, will not protect the children. It will only leave you facing whatever comes, without the full protection and authority I can offer as your mate. Together, we are stronger than any threat Osric or anyone else might pose." "You cannot promise there will be no more danger," Alira said, echoing words she had spoken before, though this time laced with far more desperation. "No," Castian admitted. "I cannot promise a life entirely free of danger. No one can offer that kind of guarantee, regardless of status or power. but I can promise that I will never stop fighting to protect you and those children, with everything I have, for as long as I live." Elira shook her head, overwhelmed by fear and grief and the impossible weight of the decision before her. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to think, to be certain I am making the right choice, not just for myself, but for the twins and the others." Castian's expression fell, though he nodded slowly, respecting the boundary she had drawn, despite the pain evident in his eyes. "I will give you whatever time you need, Elira, but please, do not let fear alone make this decision for you." He left that evening with a heaviness between them that had not existed before, and over the following days, Elira found herself withdrawing further, avoiding the lavender field where they had shared so many meaningful conversations, keeping the children closer to the orphanage grounds, rather than allowing their usual freedom to roam. Ren and Fen, sensing the shift in atmosphere, grew increasingly anxious and confused, unable to understand why their beloved caretaker had suddenly grown distant, why the visits from their favorite storyteller had stopped entirely. It was 3 days after Elira's request for space that the twins, unable to bear the tension any longer, hatched what would become their most consequential scheme yet. A storm had begun rolling in that afternoon, dark clouds gathering ominously on the horizon, the air thick with the promise of heavy rain. Elira had gathered all the children inside early, securing windows and preparing for what looked to be a significant storm, when she realized with growing horror that Ren and Fen were nowhere to be found. "They must have slipped out before I called everyone inside," she said frantically to Talia, who had come to help secure the property against the coming weather. "Where would they have gone?" Talia asked, already moving toward the door, despite the wind beginning to pick up outside. Elira's mind raced through possibilities, before settling on the one place that made the most sense. The one place that held meaning for both twins, and their scheme to reunite her with Castian. "The lavender field," she said. "They must have gone looking for Castian." The wind howled fiercely, as Elira and Talia rushed outside, rain beginning to fall in heavy sheets, as they made their way toward the field, calling the twins' names into the growing storm. Word reached Castian's camp quickly, through a village runner sent by Talia, and he was moving before the message had even fully registered, terror gripping his chest at the thought of the children lost in such dangerous conditions. He found Elira first, soaked through and frantic, searching desperately through the storm-battered lavender stalks, her voice hoarse from calling the twins' names repeatedly into the howling wind. "Elira," he shouted over the storm, reaching her side and gripping her shoulders firmly. "Where have you searched?" "Everywhere near the field," she said, panic clear in her voice. "I cannot find them. Castian, what if something has happened to them?" "We will find them," Castian said firmly, though the fear in his own chest matched hers entirely. "Doran, spread the men across the field's perimeter. Check the tree line and the old oak." As soldiers fanned out across the storm-ravaged landscape, Castian and Elira pressed forward together, calling into the wind, their earlier disagreement, entirely forgotten in the face of the far greater fear now consuming them both. It was nearly 20 minutes later, as lightning split the sky overhead, that they finally heard it. A faint cry carrying across the field from the direction of the old oak tree, barely audible over the storm's fury. They ran together, hearts pounding, until they found Ren and Fen huddled beneath the tree's largest branches, soaked completely through and shivering violently, having taken shelter there after getting lost in the storm while searching for Castian's camp. "Ren, Fen!" Elira cried, dropping to her knees and pulling both children into her arms, sobbing with relief as she checked them frantically for injury. "We wanted to bring you two back together," Fen said through chattering teeth, tears mixing with rain on his small face. "You stopped smiling again, and we thought if we found him, you would be happy." Elira's heart broke and healed simultaneously at the confession, overwhelmed by the depth of love these small children had for her, and by the lengths they had gone to in their desperate, misguided attempt to fix what they perceived as her sadness. Castian knelt beside them as well, gently helping to shield the children from the worst of the wind and rain with his own body, his expression a mixture of relief and profound tenderness. "You gave us quite a fright," he said softly, though there was no anger in his voice, only overwhelming gratitude that they had been found safe. As the rain continued pouring around them, Elira looked up and met Castian's eyes, and in that moment, surrounded by the storm and the children they had both come to love so deeply. All her earlier fear and hesitation dissolved entirely, replaced by absolute clarity about what truly mattered. "I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Trying to protect them by pushing you away, it was never going to work. They love you, Castian, and I love you too. I was simply too afraid to admit it fully, afraid that loving you would only bring more danger." Castian reached for her, cupping her rain-soaked face gently in his hands. "Elira, love was never the danger here. Fear was the danger. Fear that nearly kept us apart when we needed each other most, tonight above all." "I know that now," she whispered, leaning into his touch despite the storm still raging around them. Fen, watching the exchange with wide, hopeful eyes despite his exhaustion, tugged gently at Castian's soaked sleeve. "Does this mean you'll come back to tell us stories again?" Castian laughed softly, the sound warm despite the cold rain surrounding them all. "It means much more than that," he said, glancing back at Elira with unmistakable devotion. "It means I do not intend to leave again, if your caretaker will still have me." Elira's answering smile, bright and certain despite the storm, was answer enough for all of them. The storm showed no signs of weakening as they began the difficult journey back toward the orphanage, wind howling fiercely enough to make walking a struggle, rain falling in relentless sheets that soaked through every layer of clothing within minutes. Doran arrived quickly once word spread that the twins had been found, immediately taking charge of carrying both exhausted, shivering children, while his fellow soldiers formed a protective barrier against the worst of the wind. Ren clung tightly to his shoulders, while another soldier carefully carried Fen, both children finally beginning to warm slightly beneath thick woolen cloaks provided by the soldiers. Elira, however, had reached the absolute limit of her own endurance. The terror of the search, combined with days of sleepless worry leading up to this moment, and now the physical strain of pushing through the storm, finally caught up with her all at once. As they crossed the last stretch of open field, before reaching the shelter of the tree line, her legs suddenly buckled beneath her, the world tilting dangerously, as exhaustion overwhelmed her completely. "Elira," Castian's voice cut through the storm, as he caught her before she could fall, his arms wrapping securely around her trembling form. "I am fine," she tried to protest, though her voice came out weak and unconvincing, her body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion combined. "You are not fine," Castian said firmly, though his tone remained gentle. "You have not slept properly in days, and you have just spent the last hour fighting through a storm to find 2 missing children. Let me help you." Before she could argue further, Castian lifted her carefully into his arms, cradling her securely against his chest, as he continued walking through the storm, his pace steady and sure, despite the added weight, and the treacherous muddy ground beneath his feet. "Castian, you do not need to carry me," Elira murmured weakly, though she found herself unable to resist leaning into the warmth and safety of his hold, her exhausted body finally allowing itself to relax against him. "I want to," Castian said simply, his voice carrying quiet, unwavering devotion despite the harsh conditions surrounding them. "Let me do this for you, Elira. Just this once. Allow yourself to be cared for, rather than always being the one who cares for others." Something in his words broke through the last of her resistance, and Elira finally allowed herself to stop fighting, resting her head against his chest as he carried her the remaining distance back toward Duskwood, the storm gradually beginning to weaken around them as they moved further from the open field. Word of their approach spread quickly through the village, and by the time they reached the orphanage grounds, a small crowd had gathered despite the weather, watching in stunned silence as their visiting king carried an exhausted, rain-soaked Omega caretaker through the storm, her small form cradled protectively against him, as though she were the most precious thing in his entire world. Talia rushed forward immediately, relief evident on her face as she helped guide them toward the warmth of the orphanage's main hearthroom, where a fire had already been built up in anticipation of the children's return. "Is she injured?" Talia asked worriedly, watching Castian gently lower Elira onto a cushioned chair near the fire. "Simply exhausted," Castian said, kneeling beside her, still refusing to fully release his hold on her hand, even as others moved to help. "She needs rest and warmth, nothing more serious." Ren and Fen, now wrapped snugly in dry blankets near the fire, watched the scene with wide, sleepy eyes, their earlier fear fully replaced by quiet contentment, at seeing both adults they loved finally reunited and safe. "You carried her the whole way," Fen observed through a yawn, his voice thick with exhaustion. "I did," Castian confirmed, a small, tired smile touching his lips as he glanced toward the boy. "Because you love her," Fen said matter-of-factly, as though stating the simplest, most obvious truth in the world. "Yes," Castian said softly, his eyes returning to Alira's face, watching as exhaustion finally pulled her into a much-needed sleep, despite the activity surrounding her. "Because I love her very much." The gathered villagers who had witnessed the scene outside began speaking amongst themselves in hushed, respectful tones, the earlier whispers of impropriety and scandal, replaced now by something entirely different, a quiet recognition of genuine devotion, witnessed firsthand, undeniable in its sincerity. Ivy, who had made her way to the orphanage upon hearing news of the storm and the missing children, arrived to find the scene already settling into peaceful calm, Alira sleeping soundly by the fire, while Castian remained steadfastly at her side, refusing all offers to take his own rest, until he was certain she was truly safe and recovering well. "You have made your choice clear tonight," Ivy said quietly, settling into a nearby chair, watching the tender scene with knowing eyes. "Whatever doubts the court in Silvermoon may still harbor, there will be no denying what every soul in this village witnessed with their own eyes." "I never intended for it to become such a public display," Castian admitted, though there was no regret in his voice. "But I find I do not mind that it happened this way. Sometimes actions speak more clearly than words ever could." "They certainly do," Ivy agreed, a small smile touching her weathered features. "The children have accomplished something rather remarkable, do they not? Bringing together two hearts that likely would have taken far longer to find their way to each other without a bit of well-meaning mischief." Castian chuckled softly, glancing toward the twins, now both fast asleep beneath their blankets near the fire, utterly unaware of the significant role their scheming had played in bringing this moment to fruition. "They have indeed. I owe them a debt I am not certain I can ever fully repay." As the storm outside finally began to weaken into gentle rainfall, and the warmth of the hearthroom settled comfortably over the small gathering, Castian remained exactly where he intended to stay, quietly keeping watch over the woman who had, without either of them fully realizing it at the time, slowly rebuilt a heart he had long believed permanently broken beyond repair. Alira stirred sometime later, blinking slowly awake, to find Castian still seated beside her, his hand wrapped gently around hers, his expression soft with quiet devotion, despite the visible exhaustion in his own features. "You stayed," she murmured sleepily. "I told you I did not intend to leave again," Castian said softly. "I meant it." Alira's lips curved into a small, contented smile, as she allowed her eyes to drift closed once more, secure in the warmth of his presence, and the promise held within his simple, steadfast words. Morning arrived soft and golden, the storm having passed entirely overnight, leaving the lavender field beyond the orphanage, glistening with fresh raindrops that caught the early sunlight, like scattered jewels across the purple stalks. Alira woke slowly, warmth wrapped around her from the thick blankets someone had carefully arranged over her during the night, the crackling fire beside her having burned down to gentle embers. She turned her head to find Castian still seated nearby, though he had finally succumbed to exhaustion himself at some point, his head resting against the back of the chair, his hand still loosely holding hers even in sleep. She watched him for a long, quiet moment, taking in the rare sight of him fully at rest. The tension that so often lived in his shoulders finally eased. His features softened into something younger, less burdened by the weight of duty and responsibility that typically defined his waking hours. At the foot of her chair, she noticed Ren and Fen had also migrated closer sometime during the night, both curled together beneath a shared blanket, sleeping peacefully despite the previous night's dramatic events. The sight of all three of them, gathered so close around her, safe and whole after everything that had threatened to tear them apart, brought fresh tears to her eyes, though these carried none of the fear or grief of recent days, only overwhelming gratitude and love. Castian stirred as her hand shifted slightly within his grasp, his eyes opening slowly, before immediately finding hers, warmth flooding his expression, the moment he registered she was awake, and looking healthier than she had the night before. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning," Alira replied, a small smile touching her lips. You stayed the entire night. I told you I would, he said simply, lifting her hand to press a gentle kiss against her knuckles. How are you feeling? Better, she admitted. Tired still, but better. They remained quiet for a moment, simply enjoying the peaceful morning light filtering through the windows, the soft sounds of the twins' gentle breathing nearby, the distant call of birds returning after the storm had cleared. Elira, Castian said eventually, his tone shifting to something more serious, though no less gentle. I meant what I said last night, in the field. I do not wish to leave without you, and after everything that has happened, I find myself unwilling to wait any longer, to make my intentions fully known. Elira's heart began to race, though not from fear this time, but from anticipation of what she sensed was coming. Castian shifted, moving to kneel properly before her chair, still holding her hand gently within his own. I know that you have faced betrayal before, that trust does not come easily for you after everything you endured with your first arranged match. I do not wish to repeat any part of that history. I am not asking you to bind yourself to me out of duty, or obligation, or political convenience. He paused, his gray eyes steady and sincere as he continued. I am asking you, simply and honestly, if you would choose me, as I have chosen you. Not because a king commands it, but because I hope, with everything in my heart, that you might want the same future I find myself wanting alongside you. Tears slipped freely down Elira's cheeks now, though her smile shone through them entirely. You are asking me to choose, she said softly, wonder evident in her voice. No one has ever simply asked me before. Then let me be the first, Castian said gently. Elira, will you choose to build a life alongside me, as my equal and my mate, not because circumstance demands it, but because you wish it as freely as I do? Yes, Elira said without hesitation, the word carrying the full weight of everything she had learned to trust and believe in, over the weeks since a barefoot chase through a lavender field had first brought them together. Yes, Castian, I choose you. The soft sound of small, delighted gasps interrupted the tender moment, and both adults turned to find Ren and Fen sitting up fully now, having apparently woken sometime during the exchange, their faces bright with pure, unrestrained joy. Does this mean we get to keep him? Fen asked eagerly, scrambling out from beneath his blanket to throw his arms around Castian's neck the moment the king rose from his kneeling position. It means exactly that, Castian said warmly, lifting the boy easily into his arms while Ren rushed forward to join the embrace as well. Elira watched the scene with overwhelming happiness, her earlier exhaustion entirely forgotten in the face of such pure, uncomplicated joy surrounding her. News of the engagement spread through Duskwood with remarkable speed, and this time, rather than whispered speculation and doubt, the village greeted the announcement with genuine celebration. The story of the twin pups and their mischievous scheme to reunite two hesitant hearts had already become something of a beloved local tale, and the dramatic events of the storm, followed by Castian's public declaration and steadfast devotion, had thoroughly won over even the most skeptical villagers who had once questioned the propriety of the match. Word eventually reached Silvermoon as well, and though Councilman Osric's faction attempted one final effort to discredit the union before the full court, the overwhelming support Castian had earned throughout the ordeal, combined with clear evidence of Osric's reckless endangerment of innocent children, resulted in the councilman's swift removal from his position of influence, his schemes finally exposed and answered for in full. Several weeks later, as summer settled fully over Duskwood, the entire village gathered within the very lavender field where the story had first begun, the purple stalks, now in full fragrant bloom beneath a clear blue sky. Elira stood at the field's edge, dressed simply, but beautifully, in soft flowing fabric, adorned with sprigs of fresh lavender, woven through her hair, while Castian waited for her beneath the old oak tree, dressed in formal attire that still could not disguise the warmth and joy radiating from his expression. Ren and Fen walked ahead of her, scattering lavender petals along the path with tremendous seriousness and pride, having insisted on this important role in the ceremony themselves. Ivy stood ready to officiate the bonding, her weathered face creased with genuine happiness, as she watched the culmination of a story she had, in her own quiet way, helped guide toward its rightful conclusion. As Elira reached Castian beneath the old oak tree, their hands clasping together before the gathered witnesses, She felt none of the fear or uncertainty that had once defined so much of her life. Instead, she felt only the steady, unwavering warmth of a love chosen freely, built not on obligation or arrangement, but on genuine understanding, respect, and the healing power of two wounded hearts finding safety in each other. Do you, Castian, choose Alira freely, as your equal and your mate, honoring her strength, her kindness, and her unwavering devotion to those in her care? Ivy asked, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. I do, Castian said, his voice steady and certain, his eyes never leaving Alira's face. Freely, and with my whole heart. And do you, Alira, choose Castian freely, as your equal and your mate, honoring his strength, his integrity, and his unwavering protection of those he loves? I do, Alira echoed, her voice steady, despite the tears of joy gathering in her eyes. Freely, and with my whole heart. As the bonding ceremony concluded, the entire village erupted into joyful celebration, and later that same day, in a smaller, more private moment, Castian and Alira formally welcomed Ren and Fen as their own children, making official what had already been true in every way that mattered for quite some time. That evening, as the celebration continued around them, Alira found a quiet moment to walk once more through the lavender field with Castian, the twins running ahead of them, chasing fireflies that had begun appearing as dusk settled softly over Duskwood. Do you regret any of it? Castian asked, glancing sideways at her as they walked. The scheming pups, the political turmoil, the storm that nearly cost us everything? Alira considered the question thoughtfully before answering, watching the twins' joyful laughter carry across the darkening field. Not for a single moment, she said finally. Every difficult part of this journey led us exactly where we were always meant to be. Castian smiled, pulling her closer against his side as they continued walking through the fragrant purple field that had witnessed the very beginning of their story, now standing as quiet testament to everything it had grown to become. Then let it be the beginning, he said softly, of everything that comes next. And as the stars began appearing overhead, and two small pups continued their joyful chase through the lavender under the watchful, loving eyes of the family they had so cleverly, so lovingly brought together, Alira knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, she would face them all, finally and completely, no longer alone.